Arm, most people were taught that World War I was decided on the battlefield. Touch from. They were taught that victory was forged in the trenches of the Western Front, written by diplomatic geniuses inside carpeted cabinet rooms. And for over a century, history textbooks have opened with the exact same story: one single gunshot in Sarajevo, escalating chain of military alliances, the tragic fall of European diplomacy. On the surface, this story is clean, that is from, straightforward, softer, and dramatic. Places kings, professionals, and assassins at the absolute center of human history. It tells us that empires fell simply because soldiers fought, common statesmen failed to negotiate. But if you stop looking at the battlefield maps and step inside the dark basement vaults of the Bank of England in late 1916, a completely different history begins to emerge. While it is a history not written in heroic speeches or military honor, it is a history written in the cold, unforgiving ink of war debt. The winter of 1916 comes from the British Empire, the largest and wealthiest superpower on earth, quietly running out of cash. Every single day the war continued. The British Treasury was burning through over £5 million. That is the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, punishing into artillery shells, naval coal, and military rations every 24 hours. Coupled reserves that had backed the almighty British pound for a century were rapidly draining across the Atlantic Ocean. Where was that gold going? It was flowing directly into the bank accounts of private American suppliers, weapons manufacturers, and Wall Street financial houses. And as the war stretched into its third brutal year, the British Empire faced a terrifying financial reality. It was no longer just fighting a war of attrition against the German army. It was fighting a race against its own liquidity collapse. London had borrowed so heavily from private financial institutions in New York that it was quickly exhausting its available collateral. Without fresh credit lines, the British Treasury would soon be unable to buy steel or oil from American markets. And if those supplies stopped flowing, the Allied war effort would collapse, caused not from a German breakthrough on the Somme, but from an insolvency crisis on Wall Street. This was the missing chapter of 1917. Chapter where diplomats were no longer just negotiating peace or territorial borders. They were desperately searching for new strategic assets, new colonial promises, and a new geopolitical leverage, just to keep their credit ratings alive. And it was precisely during this moment of desperate financial overdraft a short 67-word document was drafted in London. History knows it as the Balfour Declaration. Textbooks present it as a noble diplomatic gesture, an act of moral vision, a strategic gift to secure future alliances. Inside the internal ledgers of the British Treasury and the Foreign Office, those 67 words looked less like a romantic diplomatic promise, and more like a high-stakes financial swap. That was a geopolitical mortgage, issued by a bankrupt empire, hedging a land it did not yet control, to secure the financial and political lifeline of the United States. On to uncover history. Today, we look behind the official narrative of World War I, followed from To Follow the Money, on the secret debt ledgers, and the desperate credit negotiations that permanently reshaped the Middle East. In December 1917, General Edmund Allenby stepped off his horse outside the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem. He walked through the ancient stone entrance on foot, out of respect for the holy site he had just captured from the Ottoman Empire. Photographs from that cold winter day show British soldiers standing guard along the narrow stone streets. Ottoman flags had been pulled down, and imperial proclamations were posted on public walls. To the outside world, this was the moment Palestine entered a new era. After 400 years of Ottoman rule, the British Empire was now the master of Jerusalem. Just 5 weeks earlier, on November 2nd, 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour had sent a short letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a prominent figure in the British banking family. The letter contained 67 words that would echo through modern history. Draws from His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Are from and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Not for more than a century, historians, politicians, commentators have debated the true intent behind those 67 words. Was it driven by religious sympathy? Was it a romantic strategic calculation by British statesmen who believed in Zionist ideals? Was it simply a clever wartime propaganda move to win hearts and minds in Eastern Europe? If you read standard history textbooks, you are told to choose between these conventional explanations. Not told to see the Balfour Declaration as either an act of visionary diplomacy or a tragic strategic blunder. Both of these explanations share the exact same fatal flaw. They look at the Declaration in absolute isolation. They examine the letter as if it were written in a calm diplomatic vacuum, an empire at the height of its wealth and absolute global dominance. They forget to ask the most fundamental question in geopolitical investigation. What was the financial condition of the British Empire on the exact week that letter was signed? When you open the internal financial records of the British Treasury from late 1917, a romantic image of an omnipotent empire instantly shatters. The records show that Lord Balfour did not write that letter from a position of comfortable imperial strength. He wrote it at a moment when the British Empire was facing total financial exhaustion. The British Treasury was drowning in short-term debt. Its gold reserves were depleted. Private borrowing capacity in the United States had hit a hard ceiling. And the Bank of England was warning the cabinet that Britain was months away from defaulting on its American supply contracts. 67 words were not drafted in a vacuum of moral philosophy. Drafted inside a panicked war cabinet, all searching frantically for any leverage that could pull American financial power, public opinion, and government capital directly into the European war effort. The official narrative tells you that Britain conquered Palestine on the battlefield and then generously decided its future. Financial ledgers tell you something far colder. Athens promised Palestine before its soldiers even held Jerusalem, as it needed to pledge future strategic assets to survive its present financial nightmare. Understand how an entire region was transformed into geopolitical collateral. We must leave Jerusalem behind, travel back to the smoke-filled banking halls of London in 1916. Understand the magnitude of the financial crisis gripping London in 1916, one must first understand how World War I was actually paid for. When war erupted in August 1914, most European powers believed the conflict would be over by Christmas. Financial experts in London and Paris assumed that modern industrial economies could not sustain a high-intensity war for more than a few months without collapsing. They were wrong about the duration, but they were entirely correct about the financial devastation. By 1916, World War I had transformed into an industrial meat grinder of unprecedented proportions. Victory no longer depended solely on military strategy or soldier bravery. It depended on industrial output. Millions of artillery shells had to be manufactured every month. Hundreds of thousands of horses, rifles, uniforms, and medical supplies had to be constantly replaced. And most importantly, industrial warfare required vast amounts of raw materials that Britain simply could not produce at home, particularly oil, copper, cotton, and high-grade steel. Or could Britain buy these vital war supplies? There was only one industrial power on Earth capable of supplying the Allied war machine at such a colossal scale. The United States of America. At the beginning of the war, the United States was officially neutral. Under international law, American private companies were allowed to sell goods to any belligerent nation that could pay for them. As the British Royal Navy enforced a tight blockade around Germany, Central powers were virtually cut off from American trade. This meant that nearly the entire output of American agriculture and heavy industry was funneled directly to Britain, France, and Russia. American factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York began working around the clock to produce munitions for the British military. American farmers expanded their fields to feed the British population. Standard Oil shipped millions of barrels of fuel across the Atlantic to power the British fleet. On the surface, this trade relationship looked like an unstoppable advantage for the Allied powers. Britain was buying the tools of victory, while Germany was starving behind a naval blockade. But under the surface, a lethal financial mechanism was silently grinding the British Empire to pieces. American suppliers did not accept British paper currency. They did not care about the historic prestige of the British bong-ong. They demanded payment in hard currency, physical gold, or US dollars. Gazprom, in the early years of the war, already paid for its massive American purchases by draining its own gold vaults. Just after ship, loaded with British bullion, sailed across the Atlantic under heavy naval escort, delivering physical gold to American banks. Gazprom, Britain also forced its own citizens and institutions to surrender their private investments in American railroads and companies. The Treasury seized these American securities, filed them on the New York Stock Exchange, and used the proceeds to pay for war supplies. By mid-1906, this reserve of traditional assets was completely exhausted. Britain had shipped over $2 billion in gold and securities to America. Domestic gold reserves had fallen to dangerously low levels so low that the stability of the domestic British banking system was threatened. Yet, the war was getting more expensive, not cheaper. By late 1916, Britain was spending over $5 million every single day in the United States alone. The Treasury had no more gold to ship. It had no more American stocks to liquidate. The British Empire, the financial capital of the world for over 2 centuries, operating on an imperial overdraft. If it could not find a way to secure massive, continuous credit lines in New York, purchases would stop. And if the purchases stopped, British guns on the Western Front would run out of ammunition within weeks. Inside the quiet offices of the Treasury on Whitehall, senior officials began writing panicked, confidential memos to the War Cabinet. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reginald McKenna, wrote a devastating warning to Prime Minister Asquith. Our financial position in America is approaching a crisis. We are rapidly reaching the end of our available assets. Anna warned that by the end of the year, however, Britain would no longer be able to cover its daily expenditure in New York. The great empire was on the verge of becoming insolvent in the eyes of American creditors. It was a crisis that could not be solved by winning a trench battle in France. It was a crisis of liquidity, and the key to Britain's survival was held not by British generals, but by a private banking house located at 23 Wall Street, New York. By late 1916, the financial nerve center of the British Empire had effectively shifted from London to New York City. Specifically, it was concentrated inside the Granite Building at 23 Wall Street, headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company. Early in the war, the British government had signed a secret purchasing contract with J.P. Morgan. Under this agreement, cousin J.P. Morgan acted as the exclusive purchasing agent for the British Treasury in the United States. Every shell, every rifle, every pound of wheat, and every barrel of fuel purchased by Britain and America had to pass through J.P. Morgan's hands. In return, J.P. Morgan organized massive syndicates of American private banks to issue short-term commercial loans to the British government. These were not long-term national loans issued by the United States government. They were short-term, private credit facilities backed by private financial institutions. And for the first 2 years of the war, the private mechanism worked with remarkable efficiency. J.P. Morgan earned tens of millions of dollars in purchasing fees, while Britain received a steady stream of American war supplies. As the war dragged into late 1916, the sheer scale of British borrowing reached a catastrophic tipping point. By November 1916, P. Morgan had floated over $1 billion in British unsecured loans to American banks and private investors. The private American banking sector was becoming saturated with British paper debt. American bankers began to ask a terrifying question. What happens to our money if Britain loses the war? Or worse, what happens if Britain simply runs out of collateral and defaults on its short-term debt? Our risk was no longer just a British problem. It had become a massive threat to the entire American financial system. If the British Empire defaulted on its short-term loans, dozens of major American banks would go bankrupt overnight. Seeing this growing financial bubble, the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. decided to intervene. In late November 1916, the Federal Reserve issued a stern public warning to all American banks. It strongly advised American financial institutions to limit their purchases of foreign unsecured short-term war bonds. The Federal Reserve was trying to protect the American banking system from being dragged into a European default. Targeting the British Empire's primary source of credit sent shockwaves straight through Whitehall. The moment the Federal Reserve issued that warning, the private credit market for British war bonds completely froze. American investors stopped buying British debt paper. J.P. Morgan informed the British Treasury that it could no longer float new loans on Wall Street. The liquidity trap had snapped shut. Britain was spending over $5 million a day in America, and its credit pipeline was now completely blocked. Without new loans, the British Treasury would be unable to meet its daily payments to American manufacturers by early 1917. On an internal memo written by a senior Treasury official, John Maynard Keynes laid out the cold, brutal truth to the British War Cabinet. Keynes wrote that by December 1916, the British Empire was rapidly approaching a point where it would be completely unable to pay for its imports from the United States. He explicitly warned that the American market was closing to British credit and that Britain was losing its financial independence. This was the hidden emergency behind the political crisis of December 1916. Prime Minister H. Asquith was ousted and replaced by David Lloyd George. The new war cabinet, led by Lloyd George, faced an existential dilemma. Could not win the war without American supplies. Could not buy American supplies without Wall Street credit. Wall Street credit was completely frozen unless the United States entered the war, or Britain produced a massive new form of political and strategic leverage. The British Empire was no longer operating as a sovereign financial superpower. It was operating as an over-leveraged debtor, desperately looking for a way to bail out its imperial ledger. And to find that bailout, British strategists turned their eyes away from the trenches of France and toward the strategic crossroads of the Middle East. To understand why a financial crisis on Wall Street directly impacted the fate of Palestine, one must look at the imperial map of 1916 through the lens of asset valuation. For the British Empire, there was one geographic asset that was more vital than any other territory on Earth. The Suez Canal. Opened in 1869, the Suez Canal was the central maritime highway connecting Great Britain to its most precious colonial prize, from British India. Prior to the canal's opening, British steamships had to sail all the way around the continent of Africa to reach Bombay or Calcutta, a journey that took over a month. Suez Canal cut that travel time in half. It allowed British coal, industrial goods, troops to move rapidly to Asia, while bringing back Indian wheat, Italian rubber, Australian wool, and Middle Eastern oil. If the Suez Canal was severed, the logistics of the British Empire would instantly collapse. During the First World War, the strategic importance of Suez multiplied tenfold. Over 1/3 of all food supplies reaching Great Britain passed through the canal. Hundreds of thousands of Indian and Anzac troops were shipped through Suez to reinforce Allied positions in the Mediterranean and Western Europe. And most critically, the new British Navy, which had recently transitioned its battleships from coal to oil under Winston Churchill's leadership, relied heavily on oil fields in Persia and Mesopotamia. Oil flowed through pipelines and tankers directly past the Suez Corridor. Suez Canal was not just a shipping lane. It was the ultimate imperial asset, backbone of Britain's global trade and maritime power, When the Ottoman Empire entered World War I on the side of Germany in late 1914, caused an immediate direct threat to Suez. Early 1915, Ottoman forces marched across the Sinai Peninsula and launched a surprise attack on the canal itself. Turkish forces managed to repel the attack,